assistant professor in the Department of Social Science here at York. And I'm doing a little bit of kind of last minute facilitation for the panel. I was just going to do intros, but it turns out I'm going to do facilitation, and so that'll be great because we'll be winging it a bit. So I just wanted to start by offering my deepest gratitude, my love and solidarity to the Wet'suwet'en land defenders and the Mohawks of Ganawage and Tyendinaga and Ganasatake, and to all those acting in solidarity who are putting their lives and bodies on the line to defend their rights in their lands and traditional territories, their legal and governance systems, and to hold the colonial government to meaningful account for over 400 years of genocide of Indigenous peoples. Here at York, we're currently occupying the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations who have long-standing relationships with these territories, which long precede the establishment of the Canadian state and this university. The area known as Toronto is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt, an agreement that demonstrated the collective, and ought to still demonstrate, the collective responsibility of the people to peacefully share and care for the land and waters. As many Indigenous scholars, teachers, and knowledge keepers have shown us and pointed out over and over and over again, land acknowledgements are by no means adequate. Acknowledgements must coincide with not only a deep understanding of how guests on Indigenous territories continue to benefit from lands and resources, but also changes in actions and behaviors. As we're seeing right now, the reality of the events unfolding in Wet'suwet'en and Tyendinaga and elsewhere stand in stark contrast to settler appeals to dialogue, consultation, sharing, and mutual respect. So given the topic of today's panel, there are many important links that we can make, and I'm sure folks will, around land, food, colonialism, racial injustice. And so I just want to be brief and noting my own positionality here. Just to also point folks to, I made this also a bit last minute, to show some of the work that's happening right now and ways in which folks can support and stand in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en and Tyendinaga. There's an event today. We might try and end a little bit early. There's an action today in Toronto, and then there's another action on Sunday. But there's also Unistoten, the Facebook page is constantly sort of updating on actions and ways to support. There's donation pages, the Real People's Media, and things like that. And so I just want to point to that, and just to also note, we can point to programs, systems, policies. Like the reserve system, the pass system, the banning of Indigenous food systems and ceremonies, economies practices, the Métis road allowance system. These are all just a few examples of this long history of colonial violence and domination. I was listening to Niaga and Sinclair point out today that nearly every time Indigenous peoples lose their lands, Canada's economy is used as a reason. And I think it's really important to think about that today, especially when we're talking about political economy and cooperatives and things like that. So I just wanted to note that, and I don't know what that noise is, but, and also to just end quickly on this land acknowledgement, that amid a lot of the darkness and the violence that's happening, there's also, from my perspective, also a lot of folks that are speaking to hope and integrity and courage. I'm listening to Indigenous elders, youth, scholars, knowledge keepers, that they're not there for themselves, but they're for future generations, for their kin. As Wet'suwet'en matriarchs Carla Tate and Frida Hussein have explained tirelessly over and over again, Wet'suwet'en women are taking a stand to protect the lands for all the future generations that depend on it. Youth and land defenders are acting out of love and are taking risks to protect land and life for us all. In the case of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their supporters from coast to coast, their calls are really clear. The RCMP must leave their territory, Coastal GasLink must pause for nation-to-nation negotiations, and more broadly, colonial business as usual politics is no longer an option. So the route, as Ganon Hario pointed out in Tyendinaga, using the, talking with the two-row wampum with OPP officers a couple of days ago, that this is really about land and relationships. I want to quote him here because I think this is a really great teaching. Quote, "It doesn't have, the two-row wampum is still in effect. It doesn't have an expiry, it doesn't grow whiskers or get old, it doesn't become obsolete unless one of the parties in the river disappears. The agreement is one of cooperation. It said that if there is ever rough waters ahead, that we could reach over and stabilize each other's boats. We have the responsibility to inform the other boat if there was troubled waters ahead. It seems there is some troubled water here." So again, I just want to briefly direct folks to that, offer ways of solidarity and support. And I now also just want to thank some of the organizers. So the National Farmers Union, specifically Taryn Giacomini and Brian Dale have been supportive in putting this together. And also Black Creek Community Farm, which Leticia will speak about, and other folks at York. We have a very small food issues group that we're trying to get together here, but it's very new. There's a sign-up sheet at the back for folks who are interested in following up and seeing what more can be done around food issues at York. And then also thanking supporters to put this on, so interdisciplinary social science, business and society, the Faculty of Environmental Studies, or what is now the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And so we about a month ago, a couple of us received a call from Callie saying that he was going to be in town and that if we could organize something. And so we all were really excited about that and kind of jumped at the opportunity. And so we heard about Cooperation Jackson's work combining the cooperative model with real commitment to social justice and transformation beyond capitalism. And here is the book, which is also at the back, which is for purchase. And so we were interested in learning more from him and his work, and sharing some of those opportunities, what challenges, opportunities folks are facing as farmers and grassroots organizers and activists. And so we're really here just as we'll describe and talk about in the next hour and a half, that our real concern was that industrial capitalism is undermining our ability to build sustainable food systems for everyone. And many rightfully argue that alternative economies, including alternative food networks, continue to benefit middle-class white folks like myself, and while further marginalizing communities of color and low-income folks. And so today we want to ask, what alternative economic models can we point to, and to what extent can these models help achieve food, racial, and climate justice together? So without further ado, we will introduce the panelists. So Callie Akuno is from Cooperation Jackson. Leticia Deawuo is from Black Creek Community Farm, and Adabu, Brownhill, Jefwa from the National Farmers Union. And so maybe if you folks could introduce yourself and then take a little bit of time to talk about why you do this work, what brings you to this work, and then we'll go into making some more specific links. Cool. Callie, do you want to take it away?
I can. So my name is Callie Akuno. Pleasure to be with you all today. I'm I'm gonna try to go as fast as possible, but not speak too fast. Because it's not often I get to get up this far north, and moments such as these where, you know, the very nature of the Canadian settler colonial state is being challenged don't come by too often, unfortunately. So I want to at least engage for a minute, so hopefully you all can indulge me. But yeah, I'm a member, founding member of Cooperation Jackson. I was originally born in Los Angeles, California. Lived throughout many places in my almost 50 years on this earth, throughout the United States empire. Come from a activist family, intergenerational activist family, some of which is situated right here in Toronto. And what brought me to Jackson specifically was a commitment to, in effect, a decolonization politic and program that I was born into, but also deeply and fundamentally believe, which is the quest for black self-determination and a form of sovereignty, at least freeing ourselves from the yoke of United States imperialism, and dismantling that project has been a core part of my life's work. What has brought me specifically to the work around Cooperation Jackson is trying to find some practical means to go about doing that dismantling work, but also in the midst of that, finding new ways for the community that I know, I love, I'm a part of, to break free from the economic strangulation that you know, we are kind of forced into and have been forced into since we were brought over here as property, and trying to break our way free out of that through practical activities, which for us entails taking as much of the land in our community off the commodities market as possible, so decommodifying it, put it in collective ownership, and doing collective work to develop it for the productive uses that we see fit, which are things ultimately beyond market exchange and production for need rather than production for kind of commodity and commodity exchange. So that's what we're struggling to work towards. It's easier said than done, because there's so many different ways in which both the market dynamics, the commodity dynamics of capitalism are pretty much embedded in everything in our two societies, not like y'all that much different. You know, so trying to work our way out of that by developing and harnessing the solidarity economy. Co-ops being one form of the solidarity economy, but there's all different types of exchanges, from time banks to tool sharing to, you know, joint child rearing, cooperative living, that all fall into the solidarity economy as we define it and are trying to practice it. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself, what brings me to this work, and some of the things I'd like to share with you all.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I guess what got me into this work, so my family migrated here to the Jane and Finch community many years ago. I'm saying many years as if I'm that old, but I came here when I was about 12 years old, and I live in the Jane and Finch community. Getting a little distracted. Yeah, so I came here when I was 12 years old. I've lived in the Jane and Finch community for over 25 years now. It was actually, I think, while I was living in a shelter, I went to school, I took social service worker program, was when I learned that I was poor. I know it's kind of weird to hear that for someone who lived in a shelter and then was going to school to only learn through reading a textbook that I was poor. And it was a shock to me because I thought of poor people as just people living on the street. So, you know, in terms of living in the Jane and Finch community, I got the opportunity to engage in some of the work that's impacted my community. At the time, a lot of the challenges and issues that I faced, I felt was more of my own personal issues, and I did not make the linkages between challenges that I was facing as a young single mom in the community with other challenges and issues that other community members were facing. So through my work in the community, I became one of the founding members of Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. And a lot of the work that we were doing was really looking at the special diet project, ODSP cuts, the 15 and fairness campaigns. And you know, I went on parental leave with my second kid. I came back from parental leave. I learned that, you know, I no longer have a full-time job and I'm going down to part-time. And I was recommended for a position at the Black Creek Community Farm. At the time, I'm trying to cut to the chase of the story. But it was during my time at the farm that I learned that even though I wasn't using terms like food justice, food sovereignty, I didn't understand what the hell those terms meant. But that was when I learned that a lot of the work that I had already been doing with other community members was, in fact, a food justice issue, and is very much related to that, and it's not a separate sort of thing. So literally everything that I learned about agriculture was all things that I learned while working through sometimes trial and error at the Black Creek Community Farm. So that's sort of how I came to be within the project. And really, and I always share this story, when I came into the project, I remember just getting a map of the property and just seeing names on the map. And I was like, oh, they've already divided up the land among themselves. Why are they inviting community residents here? And I felt at the time, my only route, I was like, well, let's see how I can engage community members, because I was hired as a community engagement coordinator, literally to just plan events. So I was like, okay, let's make sure I can get some dollars to artists in my community to run this event, because this project is already done for. That was literally my attitude, sort of getting into the project. But as I got more involved and became more aware in terms of the challenges and the issues in terms of the establishment of the resident council, we really started looking at the deeper issue of food insecurity within our community as a whole, and how we can sort of do that work with other stakeholders, and to truly make the Black Creek Community Farm a community farm. And it's been a very, very long and challenging journey, as some of us who have been in the trenches, as I say, have been involved, and it's an evolving project, and it's something that you know, we hope to improve upon, and to really see how we can do our piece in a bigger issue. The other part, so then I became very much also interested in small scale agriculture and what it meant in terms of my root and my grandmother, and then I became involved in Seed Change, formerly USC Canada, who does work in about 11 different countries, working with small scale peasant farmers. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adabu Jefwa. I'm actually a student here at York. I'm in environmental studies. I'm also part of the NFU, the National Farmers Union, and I'm also a farmer. I've been farming probably since I was 16, so over 10 years, just doing general labor across Canada, mostly out west in BC and Alberta, and then also here in Ontario. So a lot of my work has actually taken place most recently in Toronto, working with Food Share, doing kind of working with youth in high schools and doing educational work programs over the summer times, and that has kind of been the focus of my work. Has since then turned a lot into urban agriculture. But my roots are primarily in rural Canada, and recognizing that there's very minimal racial demographics out in rural Canada, which is where the predominant amount of our agriculture occurs. And so a lot of my work focuses, and I've been working with the NFU on this a little bit, in trying to figure out ways to make agriculture more accessible to racialized people, and more specifically racialized youth. Because I find from working in Toronto that a lot of people are very Toronto-centered and don't necessarily imagine themselves leaving the city, don't have a very strong connection to the land, don't have a very strong relationship to Indigenous knowledge, First Nations knowledge of these territories, not to mention their own Indigenous knowledges from wherever their parents may have immigrated from. So for me, as someone who comes from a racially diverse background, my mom's from the States, and then my dad is Kenyan. So I have a very sort of global understanding of the world of agriculture, but also just of our relationships with each other, and the importance of land on a global scale. And so being able to work the land here has been a really important factor in my own education of my own roots, and recognizing that that's been very empowering for people for youth who I've worked with, who've been able to use land work to talk about their own histories, their own family's histories, and their connections to not only food, but to general social issues that they've encountered themselves, and then how we all connect on those levels. So yeah, for me, that's the value of land work, is really based in social justice and racial justice, in the sense that it's a really powerful tool for education, and specifically for youth. So yeah, that's my kind of take on it.
Okay, thank you, folks. Okay, so we'll move in maybe to the next set of questions, which is really if you can make some more direct links in your work, communities, between food justice, food access, and racial justice, and I mean, also climate justice, but like that's a lot, I don't know. So what does that mean for you, I suppose, in the work that you're doing right now? Specific order. We could go back. Also, you could, flip a coin, or rock, paper, scissors. How about we do you want to start? Let's go back.
Okay, so I would say my understanding, and probably our predominant understanding in this room, is that our current agricultural system is incredibly flawed. It's the basis of, it's a huge contribution to climate change in terms of the degradation that occurs through agriculture, in terms of soil degradation, water contamination, and how that impacts people directly around those areas and on those lands, but then also the gas emissions that are emitted and that are contaminating our entire atmosphere on a global scale. So when we think about the impacts of industrial agriculture, we see it on a global scale as predominantly negatively impacting the global south. And so that means that predominantly racialized countries and people are being impacted by the industrial agricultural system. And then when we look at even within North America, we see that the impacts of climate change are impacting racialized people, marginalized people, poor people, and that there's a huge connection between not only our food system, but all of our social systems. And so those who can't access healthy food are also usually those who can't access sufficient social services. And so for me, when I look at the link between food sovereignty, it's not only food sovereignty, but it's just autonomy in general. It's being able to start at the bottom and see who is being left out, who is not able to access land, who's not able to access services, who's not able to access food, and starting with them, making sure that nobody's left behind, making sure that we start by looking at how to serve Black, Indigenous, trans, disabled peoples, and starting from there and then building upwards, because we know that those are the people who are being predominantly affected, and the rest of us are kind of getting by or are actually quite adequately being supported by the system that we live in. So those for me are the links, and is a good place to start from a bottom up solution. That's what I'll leave it at for now.
Thank you. I think I'm gonna focus maybe more on on a localized level with this particular question. Jane Finch Action Against Poverty actually launched the temporarily permanent article. If you get a chance and you go on the website jfab@wordpress.com, you find all the details there. And I say that when we talk about food sovereignty, food justice, and sort of racial justice, is to sort of think about, in the Jane and Finch community, right? We have over 100 temp agencies that surrounds the Jane and Finch community. If you go to the corner of Jane and Steele's or Jane and Finch, 4 a.m., 5 a.m., or even 3 a.m., you will see vans of cars that are picking up people and taking them to factories all across the city. Okay? So just think about that. When we think about food processing work, and we think about who's actually in the restaurants, in the back of the kitchens, when you think about who is working at the Tim Hortons, when we think about who is making those kebabs in the factories, it's all racialized, Black, brown people. Those are the people that you're going to find there in these spaces. And then, of course, when we think about the health inequities, right? High rates of diabetes, high rates of blood pressure, all the food-related sort of diet-related diseases and things, you will find dominantly Black and brown people that face the majority of some of these challenges. And then, of course, when we talk about the migrant farm worker program, when you go into the farm fields, who are you going to find there? And which communities in the city do they sometimes end up? Right? They end up in communities like the Jane and Finch community. If you go to the No Frills, and I think people who have heard me talk about this multiple times, if you go into the No Frills in our community, the quality of the food that we have there, the level of security that we have there is unlike any other in other affluent neighborhoods. So the color of your skin, as we all know, where you live, right? All has an impact in terms of your access to food and to things like that. When we talk about mining companies and climate justice issues, you know, sometimes we forget that it's these same corporations that are in countries like in the Philippines, like in Ghana and other parts of the world that are literally destroying people's food systems, destroying forests, destroying bodies of water, displacing families, displacing people from those communities. So I think in terms of linkages, when we look at food sovereignty, climate justice, racial justice, they're all the same. You can never separate sort of those issues. I see them as like one in it, sort of all as part of that challenge. And of course, when we bring it to a more localized level, because I think sometimes these conversations, we have it at such a high level that we don't see within our own neighborhoods how those type of issues are really playing out within our own communities on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's really, really important. And I do encourage you to please read the temporarily permanent that Jane Finch Action Against Poverty put out as well, in terms of the issues around temp work, the precariousness and the safety, and again, to mention Fairer Foods, who operates in our community with the location not that far from York University and another one just south of here, and also the fact that they have really horrendous safety what is the word? Standards. And also we had a 5th death, right, in that facility last year, right? And again, it's Black and brown bodies, so I guess we don't matter that much, so nothing really gets changed in terms of policy work as well. So I'll leave it as that. Thank you.
So, listening, to the both of you, I recognize how much the contexts are different. Like our contexts are different. To give you all some perspective, so I think there's 2 million people in Toronto. Is that about right?
About 2.5.
About 2.5 million people. There's less than 2.5 million people in Mississippi. Even though it's maybe about, it's at least 1/3 the size of the entire, region of Ontario. So it's not a small space. But in Jackson, where I live, it's only, it's between 200,000 people and 160,000 people. And I say between because the figures are changing. We're experiencing dynamics that I think we're going to have to, us ourselves as an organization, are trying to get ahead of where the census, which in the United States is every 10 years, they're doing a census count, starting to do a census count next month. But there's been some clear indications that our city is shrinking. And we need to kind of get a grasp on why. Because what are the long-term impacts, particularly for the overall political project and the objectives that we set out for ourselves. I won't have time to go into all of that, but hopefully you folks can familiarize yourself with the piece that we put out a couple of years ago called the Jackson Kush Plan, which kind of outlines some of that. But what I mean by the difference, so in the immediate neighborhood in West Jackson, where our project is primarily concentrated, there's roughly 25,000 people in kind of our what we call our base area neighborhood, where we're situated at, where our community land trust is at, and where most of primarily our work sites are situated. In that area, like most of Jackson, the real unemployment rate is over 50%. Food insecurity is basically ubiquitous in our community. We just recently purchased a plaza, like a whole block, to add it to the community land trust, to take it off the speculative market, which is on the street called Capitol Street, which is one of the, it used to be and will be again, if the forces of gentrification have their way, a main artery way into downtown from the Black working class communities, from throughout West Jackson in the city that's right behind us, which is Clinton to the west. So it just brings you straight down. Most of our kind of industrial property that we own is on Central Street, and for some very strategic reasons. One of which is, a very strategic calculation by our predecessors, by our immediate ancestors, both politically and organizationally, who chose working in this particular neighborhood because it's one of the highest elevated parts of the city of Jackson. Now, why is that important? Anybody paying any attention to what's going on in Jackson right now, the city is, or parts of it, is flooding. And so some folks 50 years ago had some foresight to start doing some base building in this particular area, knowing that where it was situated, like knowing your geography, knowing the land. So we've taken up that mantle and done some work there. But right across the street from us, there's an organization called Stupot, and it's the largest homeless service provider in the state of Mississippi. And so our neighborhood is known to many people throughout the city and throughout the region. It's like the homeless capital of Mississippi. And so that creates a particular dynamic around food, right? Because the main service that Stew Pot is providing is food, right? Most of the shelter is shelters and things of like, trying to give you all a picture, a different type of. So there is no, like there's no large apartment complexes. There's no large, like factories and things like that. Like it's a semi-rural type of a place in comparison to Toronto in particular, where Jackson is situated. Now it's the big city of Mississippi, but it's a semi-rural place, I think to most of you, and particularly those of you who probably grew up here in Toronto. So as a result, there's not like there's a bunch of facilities that Stew Pot can put people in for like transitional housing or anything. That doesn't exist. What folks do is basically occupy all of the vacant houses, of which there's roughly about 10,000 in the city and about 5,000 in my immediate neighborhood. So folks just basically squat. There's a massive squatting culture, that exists within the community, of which creates a bunch of class antagonism, which we can talk about maybe later, that impacts a lot of the politics in the city. So for us, just giving you that baseline, then there's food being used as a political weapon in our community, and still being used as a political weapon, primarily in how Stew Pot is constantly attacked, and has been attacked for many years. This is probably one of the most stable periods for them, I would say, this last 5 years. And one of the things that's made it stable, they've been around a lot longer than we have, is us. Is that they have now a political force which is not opposed to the homeless and people being, in a precarious situation around housing. We're the first neighbor they've ever had who's never complained or went down to the city and demanded that they leave, or they be uprooted, or they move someplace else. And for us, them being there is kind of a symbiotic relationship, because they've created certain conditions which make it easier for us and our land trust to kind of grow and expand, because nobody wants to be there. So as long as the homeless population there, it gives us a certain kind of dynamic to be able to build from above, right? So we didn't plan that piece out. That's just kind of how some things have played out. But with Stew Pot constantly being under threat, constantly struggling for funding, with some, they get some government support, and that's always kind of yanked and pulled, new conditions being placed upon them. It creates constant waves of just food insecurity on a very practical level that you see in our community, that we therefore then have to kind of play as kind of a backdrop. And we have one of our core co-ops is Freedom Farm, which is an urban farming cooperative. And it does a mixture, and increasingly doing a mixture, of producing straight for just direct community use, which is not for sale, but for distribution primarily along a time banking system, and then producing enough to at least subsidize the work so that the work can continue, right? So producing for the market. But one of the main things that we are really trying to do as a political objective, food sovereignty is one of the long-term objectives that we have. And not in a rhetorical way of, just wanting to produce good quality food to deal with the health disparities, which are ripe in Mississippi. Mississippi is, of all the states in the United States, Mississippi is either always 1 or 2 in hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, by any metric you look at. Obesity, it's always up there. And a large part of it is that in almost every place in Mississippi, including Jackson, you have to have a car to get to a grocery store. And most grocery stores are about a mile from where most people live. And now in our neighborhood, I was mentioning the plaza, there was no grocery store there. It left a couple of years ago. We're working to bring it back actively now. But the largest kind of supermarket, if you would, in my immediate community was the Dollar General. And they just decided they're going to up and leave. They're moving out of our space in end of this month. So by the end of this week. And so that's leaving a big, huge gap that we have to fill. So look, one of the long-term things that we are trying to get at is in the context that we exist in, which is extreme right-wing politics, which is like right next door. So to understand, like Jackson is a majority black city, and it exists right on the banks of the Pearl River. That's how it developed and why it developed. It was initially an indigenous to Choctaw Nation trading post. On the other side of that river is Rankin County. Rankin County is where, you know, the most concentrated right-wing Christian forces of, you know, the Klan with the sheets, the Klan without the sheets, the more sophisticated political forces, they all live there. And so, like, the contrast and the opposition is very stark, is very real, and it's very apparent, and it's very open. You know, like my political enemies know where I live. They've posted it up on you know, websites and chat groups, and I know where they live. You know, where their houses are. Like, this is the type of environment I live in, where the nature of certain types of threats are very real, apparent, and ominous. So for one of the major things for us that we're trying to do over the course of this next year in particular, kind of getting ready for what we think is going to happen. We're not predicting the future, but we're just, you know, reading our situation in our context. And that's that Trump is going to win and the society is going to go even further to the right. And that we need to prepare ourselves the long haul for the step up in hostility, which is coming from the forces that he's been galvanizing and bringing to the forefront. Food security takes on a new meaning in that context, is where I was going to. And so for us, one of the things that we're gearing up to do is set up a major hydroponic, aquaponic operation in that mall area, because we're aiming on how do we feed 20,000, 25,000 people when they close the grocery stores or when they barricade a number of different things, which could easily happen. We don't want to be dependent upon the larger system for our subsistence and survival, and we know historically, given dynamics in Mississippi, that's clearly an option that white supremacist forces will resort to. So that's kind of what we're aiming for and planning for in the context of everything else that you all mentioned, you know, which is a real foundation, but there's kind of an immediate threat that we're trying to build to be able to be autonomous and to be self-determined.
I mean, I don't know how, sorry, again, winging it. I don't know if, like, I have a couple of questions, but we can also throw it out to the group and see, like, what folks are looking to ask, especially, you know, we only have, time check.
40
yeah,
minutes?
Yeah.
40 minutes, so, and apparently, a French translation. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions around time banking, how you folks are doing that, and the cooperative model. Those are all sort of coming into my mind about like how that actually, how you folks are. Well, we at dinner last night. We had a more in-depth conversation about that stuff, and it was really, really interesting. But anyways, I don't know if folks would prefer that we throw it out to the group and ask if there's some questions from the audience. I can run around and do this, or if we're using this for accessibility purposes, but if folks are okay with speaking and not using it, that's also okay. Do folks have some more specific questions? Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I speak?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. So my name is Shah. I am a gardener in Scarborough area, and I am from a Bangladesh, you know, very crowded and populated area, and people are fighting for food because they have no enough land to grow, and there is a vision or slogan in our country that even 1 inch of land should not be left unused, should be cultivated. And we are doing. A small country like Ontario, but 1800 million people. Okay, very crowded. So that country is affected by climate action also, because you know that is low-lying area country, and the snowmelt water due to climate, they goes there. Sea level rise, flooding, storm, cyclone, drought, lots of things are being happening, and the food are being destroyed. But Canada or Toronto, there is lots of land available, but that are not being used. In the park area, in the hydro corridor, and any other location, we see there's lots of land not being used. Even not as dog walking area also, completely empty. So we in Scarborough area, we have also community garden, but there is small plots, but we are fighting for that plots. Every 2 years or 3 years rotating. We applied to the city, not getting enough plot. So, and I am asking to the panel, how we can get more garden, more community garden area to cultivate, to grow more food, because food is very important. In my area, there is a food bank also. Before it was about 50 people per day, per week. Now it is more than 100. They allowed almost all area of that area, but now they have restricted to 4 buildings. Still enough people are coming. Those food are also not good, not healthy food, backdated. And also that's why, because Toronto or Canada has enough land, so how we can utilize those land? That's my question to the panel. Thanks again.
Are we okay with taking like a couple? That. Oh, whoa. Questions as well? I don't know.
Hello. I was really impressed by the action of taking a plaza and thinking ahead about like creating hydroponic like systems in order to think ahead of political action or like kind of like military like warfare kind of things. And I was really also for instance, in Canada, vacant lots are highly protected by the state. They're surveyed, there's lots of security, a lot of police around it, even though we have laws that if you are able to hold on to land that nobody's using for like extended amount of years, you can like absorb it in a way, but that's the reason why there's so much private property being surveyed at the moment. I kind of very much believe that unconditional housing is a food justice issue, and that if people were able to have unconditional housing, then they'd also be able to farm and grow and things like that. Because we have conditional housing, some of those things mean that we cannot grow our own food. But then certain ways that people who don't have food are told, like, oh, just learn how to like balcony garden or things like that, and they're not necessarily substantial. I'm interested in if there are any actions towards cooperative housing in the visioning of food sovereignty.
Do we want to take these two and then or there's one there? I don't understand. There's one more.
Yeah, I wanted to talk, just ask, particularly from Mississippi, but Black Creek, it might be relevant as well, about access to land as a basis for autonomy. And I'm remembering, I'm just reading, you probably know it, Monica White's book, Freedom Farm, and the history of the civil rights movement, and is Freedom Farm the same, your Freedom Farm the same that Fannie Lou Hamer?
No,
had?
it's sorry,
Just
go ahead.
named after it,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. But something about that, and also about how the cooperative model works, and how hard or easy it is to get access to land. And it's hard in Toronto, but it'd be what you'd want to say about it, I think.
That's great, yeah.
Just making sure everyone's awake.
I think it's a little tweaking, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks in Toronto have a lot of similar questions around what the land context looks like, what land access looks like, and co-ops.
Yeah, I was trying to contextualize. So we don't have no problems with access to land where I'm at. Ownership of it and being able to claim ownership of things can be a challenge. But in terms of just actual access to land, that is not a challenge we have in Jackson. And to a large extent, it's not a challenge we have in Mississippi. Like I said, you know, it's together, the land mass is like bigger than Holland and Denmark almost combined, right? So it's not a small land mass. It's not that hardly populated at all. So there's a lot of access to land. One of the challenges, however, that we have, I would say to a degree, is kind of cultural stigmas to farming. You know, coming from a people who were basically forced to farm for somebody else's profit and benefit for 230 plus years for no pay, there's some deep stigmas of like, I ain't trying to go back and work on no damn land, trying to get away from that. So that's a challenge kind of that we have, is encouraging a large number of folks to do it. But similarly, but there are, particularly amongst folks who were not born in Jackson, but born more up in the Delta, which is just due northwest. Folks have their own farms and garden plots in their backyard on a mass level. That's just kind of a cultural practice. Unfortunately, it's just not passing down the generation, just like folks who are 50, 60 and up. And so a large part of our work is trying to, you know, really encourage a lot of folks in their 20s and teens right now to take up farming, right? And to see it as maybe not the most viable form of employment. We ain't gonna lie to people about like you gonna, you know, make a lot of bank by doing farming, but it's like here is a stable, healthy way of living that you could be autonomous, make your own time, make your own schedule, live how you want to live, work the hours you want to work. Now it's a lot of hard work. We don't allow people that it's not, but you know, about the level of just freedom that they would have if they made that type of choice. We've had some success. You know, our organization is fairly young. The vast majority is under 30. And we got all the different dynamics that comes with that. You know, so for us, the thing that we've been really trying to do, Mississippi, or at least Jackson, right now is in the context of a major, very strategic economic decapitalization, I would say the last 30 years, where capital is pulled out of its resources. And so the land is relatively cheap right now. It's not going to stay that way forever because, you know, land is an asset in capitalism that to a certain extent never really truly depreciates. So it's just depressed now, but it's starting to go up. And in fact, us creating the land trust is actually, in fact, increasing some of the speculation and causing some of the things to rise. So even despite our efforts to take it off the market, it's still kind of encapsulated in market dynamics. That's a larger political question that folks have to realize that we're kind of dealing with. So it's kind of like creating a little zone of a certain degree of flexibility, but then all the things around it, the property value is going up, and that creates kind of problems for other folks who may not have access to loans to keep their land, and something we're trying to figure out. And part of the thing we're trying to do is encourage more folks, particularly elderly folks, to place their home in the land trust. if their children don't want to take it or some extended family member doesn't want to take it or don't have the means to like pay for the taxes or keep it up. So things of that nature. But so yeah, some of the other things is I mean, you all, as I was saying last night, y'all are in one of the hearts of international capital, right? And so things are expensive here. Land access is going to be very limited as a result of that. So I think there's the only way you're going to really be able to deal with it is build a mass movement that exerts a amount of political pressure to open up the space. And I don't think there's really no way of getting around that. So there's a lot of education, organizing work that's going to take time to get people to understand and the need for that. And then there's a mass distortion, I think, that also exists that I find in the United States, it may not be here, between our context and other contexts, is that folks are used to having access to global products in big cities in a way that people in my community are not. So that creates a different condition around, it's a different type of expectation of what's going to be in the grocery store and what's not. That makes it a little bit easier for me to sell people on local foods or the traditional foods that they have and not, be wanting all these other things, to a degree. And we've seen that in terms of trying to ally with other folks around things that people have access to produce, and they want us to produce a whole bunch of exotic stuff that don't fit our soils. And we're like, nah, we just, we're not interested. You'd be like, oh, you make money, but it's going to deplete our soil. So there's other ecological factors of things that we have to take into account. Like this is not going to work for us, no matter how much money you want to pay us. We're just not going to do that because it's not conducive to our long-term needs. But I think that's the biggest piece. And then just speaking briefly to shut up, the co-op. So we've took on the name, trying to uphold the tradition, invoke that memory, invoke that consciousness, learn from that particular struggle. But there is no direct continuity. There's roughly 40 years of distance between when we started and when Freedom Farms, kind of closed down up in the Delta area. And for us to be clear, we've made a long-term commitment to try to make sure that our farming operation has balanced books, but not necessarily that it has to make a profit, because farming in the United States is not that profitable and it's deeply, deeply subsidized. I think often to the detriment of all of us on the planet, the way it's subsidized. So our thing is we're doing that as a collective decision. It works as a cooperative, functions as a cooperative, but we don't really expect it to make a profit, right? Because the thing that we're building towards as part of the political commitment is you guys are working towards helping us reach, food sovereignty. Food security is a step, food sovereignty is the next step. So that's something we've collectively decided that this co-op may lose money for the next 10 years. And we're all fine with that. But that means we all have to take some collective responsibility in the other co-ops to figure out ways to help it out and give it money and give it resources. The benefit that we have is because they operate on the community land trust, they don't pay any rent. So that makes a lot of things very easy. And for that practice to be able to be maintained without threat of, well, if I don't make rent, I'm going to get kicked off. They're never going to get kicked off because we made that political commitment. And so that's where for us is to understand our project. I think you got to see the comprehensive whole of how we try to put the pieces together and how they fit together.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm more interested in, you said that you have access to land, but in terms of the ownership is where it's a bit more difficult. Could you just elaborate just a little bit on that?
I mean, what I mean by that is there's a lot of homeless folks who have their own little plots of land in the places that they occupy. They will never have title, ownership to that land, but they can use it because there's a community expectation that it is better for it to be used than for it to not to be used, right? And people would rather it be, given some of the class dimensions, people prefer that than folks who just might come in and don't do anything with it or don't try to improve the house. And some particular ways of just squatting in it. And so the ones where there's farms, you see a lot more community support for that. But what I mean is there's so much open land, there's so many vacant houses or so many vacant lots. You can just, you can come in my neighborhood and just, you can probably get you about half an acre of land, and I'm not exaggerating. That's just available for you to farm. And if you start farming it, nobody will say anything like, oh, you can't use that, you can't do it. People be like, cool, can I help you? I'm not gonna be out working with you every day, but I'll come help you a little bit, or I'll make sure that nobody touches your stuff. That kind of stuff, that level of culture expectation is there. So the access is there because of the conditions, but it doesn't mean the folks who are occupying those lands are either trying to get ownership of them or can get ownership of them. Ownership in Mississippi is very constrained, right? And like you all have property rights and renters' rights here. There's no such thing as a renter's right in Mississippi. It basically does not exist. So the ownership is everything in Mississippi. So if the owners of that land want to come in, one day, they've been gone for 20 years and say, I want this back to do something, with it, the state would be there tomorrow to kick you off the land. It's not like they would wait. They would, the state will respond. It's just right now, because of the kind of the undeveloped state, to use that term, like the state doesn't trip that there's people occupying homes because they actually don't have the capacity to kind of enforce everything, so they kind of concentrate their limited energy. We're going to focus on downtown area. We're going to focus primarily the white areas in the north. That's where they concentrate their forces. And the rest is just basically kind of a wasteland until there's a problem, or unless they just want to contain the population. It don't really show up too much.
Is the land trust secure?
Nothing in Mississippi that black folks have is secure. They right now, there is no eminent domain in Mississippi. And the reason why there's no eminent domain is because Chokwe Lumumba wanted to use it when he was a city councilman to fight the housing crisis. So the state, legislature, which is dominant, a Republican reactionary supermajority, said no, we're not going to allow that to happen. So they took it off the books. It don't mean they won't bring it back if it's going to service their needs. So we build it with the expectation that we're going to have to build the might to defend it, right? But you're existing in there's a place where my folks were ran out of Mississippi 60 years ago, literally ran out of Mississippi 60 years ago and moved to Los Angeles for fighting back, and the house is getting burned out, or so that it's not like some of that has changed, but not that much. And under the new conditions where now it's acceptable on a national level and even to an international level, they're becoming more bolder, and we see white supremacist forces, organized forces of white supremacy. They come into Jackson. They wouldn't do that 5 years ago. They wouldn't cross the river. They cross the river now. They haven't done so much of anything other than little protests here and there. But just trust me, a couple of years ago, they would never even cross that river.
Do you want to respond?
I might say something. I guess I have this one actually. I'll use this as cool.
Okay, so I wanted to respond to the questions about access to land and then the housing vision within food sovereignty. I don't necessarily have tangible, practical answers of directly how to interfere with the state and access land. But I think part of my work that I was mentioning before in terms of kind of, and I think it has to do a lot with what Kelly was talking about, starting educational groups and really getting people on board with this idea of liberation through land movements. And that relates to what I was saying earlier about trying to organize people and kind of shift people's ideas around what symbolizes wealth, and starting to try to organize people to start thinking about wealth as not being material to cars and fancy things, which a lot of young people are really hip on right now, but starting to understand that wealth comes from health, and that our health is reliant on our food systems, and that if we really want to strive for the best qualities of life for not only ourselves as individuals, but our families and our communities, that entails trying to obtain land. And so trying to organize people to really get on the idea of saving your money and trying to collectively organize how to get land. And as much as I would love to be able to do that in a more radical, let's just go claim something and sit on it and wait until someone tries to kick us off of it. I don't necessarily, I mean, I vouch for it, but I think there's also, at least in my own life, trying to figure out, okay, like how do I organize people to really start thinking about how do we pool our finances and actually just start accumulating land together. And then from there, starting to figure out how do we then turn these plots of land that we might obtain into actual housing for ourselves, as well as plots for growing stuff. And I think that does really, in terms of at least like within Toronto, it really does have a lot to do with being able to say, we can't necessarily afford land in Toronto or right outside of Toronto, which is like the most expensive land. But let's start organizing where is the cheap land available. Like there's a lot of cheap land farther out in rural areas within the East Coast, or maybe out by like Quebec and stuff like that. And a lot of people don't necessarily think like, okay, I'm gonna leave Toronto and go live in rural Canada around like a bunch of white people, and that's not appealing. But if we're actually gonna think 10 years in the future of like how are we gonna sustain ourselves, urban agriculture is definitely on the come up, but there is definitely something to be said for collective ownership of land within rural environments, and having to really organize like, okay, like I understand the concept of, especially for racialized people, wanting to stay within their communities, and then on top of that also having this vision of wealth that is really based in capitalism and consumption and material consumption, that isn't actually sustainable for our futures and for the futures of our families and our communities.
Okay, I think we still have time for some more questions. I saw Cheyenne.
Hi. This question was for the last person that spoke. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Adabu. Yeah. And obviously everyone else, because y'all are cool. I wrote some of my points down. So speaking to your point about like mobilizing collectively and moving rurally, I like, as a farmer myself, and someone who farms year round in Toronto, probably no Sundance harvest, I wanted to do that initially, but then I found out as a youth, farming with other youth, telling youth to go rurally and farm, I felt like that wasn't what a lot of my friends wanted to hear, especially considering like I have a disability and I can't be away from social services, my friends do as well. And I think that really what a just food system is having an established urban agriculture system, that so youth don't have to leave rurally and farm. Because for me, when I left rurally and I farmed in Ennisville and outside of Hamilton, I found that it was good, but it's still so hard to find those established communities. So I do agree with that point, but then on the flip side, I think that with projects like the Flemington Park project right now with Food Share, them getting large piece of land and parceling that off so people can actually have like sustainable urban agriculture, you know, and have money and make income from that is really important. And I see that as like the future. I obviously do believe in like rural farming. I'm probably going to move to like a rural farm in 2 years, but I would rather see right now, like in urban agriculture, youth running their own urban farms and there being enough space, because there is space in the city, like that gentleman over there said. You see space and you see there's large swaths of land, and I think with proper mobilization, but mainly policy, things could change. So that's what I think, yeah. Thank you.
And then you had yeah. Why don't we do those?
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. So I wanted to just sort of go with what Adabu was saying about revisualizing what wealth is and shifting values a little bit. And I just wanted to know from Kylie about how Cooperation Jackson uses time banking, you mentioned as well too, and like looking at how when folks don't necessarily have a lot of wealth to begin with, you mentioned the high unemployment rate, for example, and how people can mobilize and use what they have to be able to support each other in a different kind of like that solidarity economy.
Thank you very much for each and every one of your points. Very insightful, very educational. Adabu, you did mention obtaining land, and that is our way to working towards food sovereignty and autonomy. And I'm just wondering, just because from an archaeological perspective, I do Black archaeology here in Ontario, and through that, learning about the dynamic early Black settler sites that focused on agricultural systems, it is crazy, and some of them still remain. So I'm wondering if there's a way, if there's issues of obtaining land, that we can make these solid connections and networks, relationships with these existing Black communities like in Chatham and in Buxton. I know that's very far. There's also a few closer to home, as well as just with some Indigenous community members where we can kind of start from what exists versus creating something new that possibly could be a struggle for us.
That's a Toronto. That's a Canada question.
That's okay. Do you have anything to speak to that?
No, not really.
Okay, so first of all, yes, I agree with the urban agriculture movement, especially as we see that populations are migrating to urban centers. I think that's crucial and fundamental. I do think that it does tie into the other person's point about when we're talking about sustainability in terms of not only food but also in housing, and I feel like there's a huge shift that would have to occur within our urban dynamics of how sustainable housing works, and then that link to the food as well, because I find that for probably the majority of people are renting, that's not sustainable, for most people in terms of like the long term, in terms of intergenerational. People don't necessarily, we know that the wealthiest people are wealthy because they have ownership over something, and they don't have to continuously be in a crisis of housing, and then they can turn their focus onto, okay, then now that I'm stable in my housing, I can also start to establish relationships on how to maintain the other necessities of my life, which would be food and water and all these other things. So in terms of urban agriculture, I think it's like super crucial for that to be building and growing. But then I do kind of struggle with that, like understanding that it would have to be a much deeper shift with people being able to have access to not only land for food growing, but also access to stable housing in that. So that's like a 2-point thing. And then to the point about the already existing communities within Ontario and across Canada, I think that that's super important too, that there should be a lot more education around the history of Black people in Canada and their ties to agriculture within Canada, as part of that education with young people to really say, look, like these are parts of our roots. These things, this is not like, these communities already exist and we should be building alliances with them, because I find that especially within Toronto, people don't know that history. They'll see themselves as existing outside of the city. So both the urban and the rural, I think, are crucial. And then that ties in with something, the next one point that I did want to make. You mentioned the like other Indigenous movements that are happening, and I think that that's a crucial crucial point within food sovereignty is understanding that Indigenous people, First Nations people within Canada are fighting for their own sovereignty, which includes food sovereignty, and that there really needs to be much more education and mobilization around joining movements around food sovereignty to make sure that we're including and respecting the Indigenous First Nations movements, but that there needs to be a collaboration and that and making sure that everyone has their place within Indigenous food sovereignty. It's not that Indigenous people have their own thing and everyone else is kicked off the land, or no one else is able to have their own autonomy. I think part of Indigenous sovereignty is being able to make space for people to maintain their cultural, traditional ways of life, and then to make space for other people, considering, especially within Canada and the States as well, that people have migrated from all over the world. So there's many Indigenous people from all over the world who live on these lands and can't necessarily just go back to where they're from to be able to establish their Indigenous sovereignty. I feel like there's a huge importance for being able to build Indigenous sovereignty and recognizing that means sovereignty for everyone, and for those who have been here for years, including settlers, white settlers as well. So yeah, that's that.
Do you want to speak to the time banking stuff? I think that there's
So maybe like specific questions that folks have, is because it's a constantly evolving system, and this year we're taking some steps to move it beyond just the immediate membership of the organization, and try to make it a broader exchange system within the community. So our outreach team is trying to build a lot more firmer relationships on this question with a lot of local businesses, so that folks can actually go there and exchange, either a currency that's in discussion, or just, however we're going to do it, like cards and some other stuff, utilizing some technology to both denote and exchange like ours. So that's something that folks are doing, like little prototyping type stuff. The hardest piece is just get on that end, is getting the businesses to kind of believe in it outside of us. So that's a challenge, and it probably will be, I think, for a while. But we're going to keep hammering at the door on it regardless. And I think it's going to have mixed results. There's some sectors I know will easily do it, and others probably not to the bitter end will they, probably come on board. But in principle, how it works for us, if that's the part I think we could ask, in principle, it's when we do kind of a one-to-one equivalent, which is it's like 1 hour is worth one kind of unit or one credit, and you can exchange that one credit in negotiation with whoever's providing you with a service. So it's just typically like childcare, some healthcare service providing, mainly like some folks in our organization and network who do acupuncture, chiropractic work. They're bought into it, and then the other main piece is what we're talking about, which is food exchange. So typically, what people will do, how we do most of them, we'll do like these what's called Kazi days, and somebody will pick a project. Either the farm needs some extra hands, for like a weekend, or we're fixing up a house or gutting a house, or we've been painting something, or we're doing some construction. We'll put a general call out to the membership and say, come do some Kazi with us at 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock or whatever. Folks come in, you do your signing, you do your registry for the time bank, you get that credit, and you use it whenever you want to within the services that are provided by different members. So that's basically where it's at right now, but we want to extend it because it gets into a larger question about the quality of life and being able to share, create value amongst each other that's not monetized. So we kind of operate outside of that, and it's something that we can do in abundance, whereas trying to exist within the cash economy in a place where there's over 50% unemployment, we know that's a limited resource, right? But people, everybody has, to a degree, time and some level of skill, something that they can offer. I think it's the challenge is creating a sense of relationships where people trust each other to engage, you know, in certain mediums of exchange with people that they don't know, right? You know, because we still at that dynamic where folks exchange primarily amongst like 2 or 3 degrees separated amongst them. And so being able to really extend it out, you know, for a lot of different things, that's still something we're growing into.
I just want to make a comment, and I'm very thankful for, I don't know. Adabu. Okay. For coming back to the indigenous people, because when I see the solidarity and support and what you said at the beginning, I just want to make one comment to see what we're all up against. That when you talk about food sovereignty, you need land, and how do you get land in a system as where we live? Is you have to buy it, and you don't have money and whatever. So you have to buy land, whatever you can, what you can get. And you were talking about there's relatively cheap land and so on. So that's the situation here, and I really have to commend the people to that for what you're doing with the community garden, and you know what you're up against. Now I'm from the north, not originally. I just got stuck there and I came to Canada, and that's an example too. Like I'm white, as you say, and I'm married to a indigenous woman. And so we are down south right now, and when I say north, I don't mean North Bay, I mean like north, where there's winter right now. And the land is there, so and people have access to the land. And you see at the example of the Wet'suwet'en that how long do we have access to the land until the system finds out there is something they want to have, and then all of a sudden you don't have any rights anymore. So we have the same situation in the north with the Ring of Fire, you might know, Ontario. That and that there's food sovereignty. What it means for the people up there is also they have the land, they get the food from the land, and then they are not allowed to use the land anymore. And that is happening right now in northern Ontario as well. So we just have to, I just want to remind everybody where we are living and what we are up against. And I really admire you guys that what you have to deal with to do your stuff and your gardening and whatever, and share the food, because that is not always seen as a positive thing if somebody else wants your land, and that is what's going on in the north. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot for coming and speaking. I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about different agricultural techniques, especially tying to the care of the land being used. You'd mentioned using hydroponics and aquaponics in specific spaces. So I'm just interested in how food ownership and production how it is being developed in like parallel with dismantling sort of destructive and exploitative processes, especially with access to tools and technologies, and how that connects with things like production rates and like how many people a specific plot of land can use, as well as the distribution of the food being grown.
I mean, I can tell you in our case, we have a lot of young folks who are learning how to farm. And before really joining us, they ain't farmed anything. So the learning curve is pretty high. In general, the methodology is what we describe as Africology, what other folks would typically describe as permaculture, permaculture design. There's some variances and differences between them, but I think the fundamental principles of learning and studying the land and obeying kind of what it needs and wants is the fundamental way about going about doing that. There are some challenges, I think, that we are seeing around changing people's consumption habits, because there's some things which people in our context like love, but they're actually not that good for the soil. They're better grown like elsewhere, but then kind of what's the carbon footprint of us consuming that? Trying to be ecologically conscious. So these are things that we are learning. I mean, as an organization, we are learning and trying to figure out, and then, as I was mentioning, trying to balance the kind of need to at least make enough to cover the bills and taxes and expenses for each of the co-ops, but not engaging things merely to accumulate profit, which puts you also right back into the other extractive and destructive behaviors, and being part of the carbon and toxin market. So there's a fine balance in ways that we're trying to learn, through our own bookkeeping and calculations. We're trying to develop what's called what we call an anti-capitalist business model, because it really isn't one that we've ever ran into. To just accumulate profit and maybe you distribute it a little bit differently than the corporations do. And that's like we're saying that's not enough. That's what we're kind of seeing. Like, if we're going to really be responsible for taking care of the earth and being good stewards, we got to calculate this a little bit differently. We ain't figured it out. We're far from being perfect, but constantly, challenging ourselves and asking the question like, well, why would we do this if we just imported that from 200 miles away when maybe we don't need it? Like asking those questions. Maybe we do something else. Maybe what's the substitute, wood or fabric or fiber that's grown right here in Mississippi, or that we can grow in Mississippi that would be a substitute for that? Like, these are the real questions that we are starting to challenge ourselves with. So check back with us in about 2 or 3 years. We'll have, I think, a far more advanced analysis, but like the Africology permaculture is fundamentally our methodology of doing things.
Thank you. So, not being a farmer, I do have the farmers from the team in the back who could probably answer this question much better than I can. But we try to, promote biodiversity at the farm, and we try to, farm in a way that can take care of the environment. I'm not using the proper words, and I'm sure Amy is cringing in the back there. But we try to make sure that in terms of even creating different habitats and different things at the farm that can support different pollinator life and different wildlife on site is a big piece of the work that we do. And we've lost our tractor, but right now a lot of the work is through labor. Yeah, thanks.
I think it's also just your question got me thinking. You asked about technology, and specifically on that and on tools. I think recognizing that farm work is a lot more than just understanding land and working with soil. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes into farming. There's a lot of technological knowledge that needs to be held in order to be able to, say, work tractors or technology, or even how to make our own tools and stuff like that. So I think understanding that farming is, when we're talking about farming, or at least when we're talking about food sovereignty and we're talking about farming, we're really talking, at least in my head, I'm talking about like a really huge, almost like community that has to function in order to maintain the farm work, but that is really fundamentally built on a number of different skills and a number of different backgrounds that people need to come from, and in order to make that system work. So we need people who understand technology. We need people who understand construction. We need people who understand how to process food. Like, growing food is only really one aspect of it, or understanding climate and soil is really only one aspect of agriculture, which is why I think like food sovereignty and small-scale organic agriculture is really the basis for a whole system change, and it really goes against all capitalism, because it really relies on us coming together and sharing the knowledges and understanding that we all have an individual role to play in order to create a system that suits us all, that's based on food but has everything to do with every other aspect of life. So yeah, I just wanted to I was thinking about that when you asked your question.
I think we'll close it at that.
That's okay.
Wait, what's happening? Quick question?
It's more like a comment what I'm going to say, about Urban Act in, can I say it?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so urban agriculture in Toronto, what is the big picture, We have a lot of land, I would say, what can be available, but we say right now in the conversation, it's very political, and we need to be very active in those movements, For example, who own a lot of land here? TRCA, Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. They own more than 15,000 acres of land here in Toronto. So how we can be political together to asking to access to the land, where we can grow live food. Other important aspect, it is about who are the farmers who get subsidized in Ontario and Canada in general. I will do an exercise all the time I do it with everybody when I talk about food. Take your phone and type right now farmers in Ontario, and you will see everything is coming, just only white people and males. That is something where we need to talk right now, The lack of diversity on the food system is very broken and very white supremacy, I would say, because if you are a racialized person, a person of color, you need to work maybe 20 times harder to demonstrate to the financial and political people your systems work. That is something where we challenge here. The city of Toronto, the policy where they have it are very oppressive to racialized communities. It's a law, the green spaces and parks, but my friend shall say, you submit an application, and usually of 100 applications, maybe they approve just only 2 or 1 to a racialized community. So how you challenge those systems? How you are coming together? And I would say everything starts with your counselor, Put those petitions. They have in a sign about community engagement. When you participate in conference and workshops and training, most of the time you see just only white people talking about farming and access to that one, so you don't see people the same as us to talking about what is our challenge, Because when you go to those conferences, you see more people talking about big crops. I call those one cash crops, like corn, soya beans, canola, where they're subsidized, milk, farmers, versus when you're in a smaller scale where you want to feed your community, you don't get any support from any level of government. So you are alone. How we can come in together about those aspects. National Farming Union, I see that one. It's beautiful what they're doing, but I think they have a little bit of black representation there. I know that you are there. Thank you for bringing our voices there. And that is good, how we can be very political and possible very strong voices to bring into the food system, because that is a lack. I know it's a lot of young people who are interested to doing farming, but I can tell you, we need to demonstrate 3 or 4, 20 times harder for the job. We can do it and can be very nice and dance, but it is very difficult for us, to be very participating on those spaces. I still I like to, I know it's hard to do farming. How many of you do farming right now, or gardening and big scale? It is hard, and I would recognize, and all the time we're talking about this, but we need to talk about our mental health too. Because it's super hard. It's a lot of burnout, and especially if you are a rationalized person, to do farming. So that is something where I can't lay sorry about that, but I hope that that conversation happened, because that is sovereignty, how you, or as Adabu say, your mental health or your health is going on in your own community, we can be agree to disagree, but I don't want to leave my community. I want to get access to land here in Toronto and feed my own community. No growth. I don't want to go to Quebec. I want to stay in Toronto. But this is something, how we can navigate those systems and to stay here, and we are okay. Right now we are in a big university, York.
Plenty of land.
And you see that how many green spaces. I was driving with Lou, and I was telling, look at all that green space just on his grass. Why we don't making a huge community garden or a lemon garden where all the student community can grow food? So we need to think about that, how we can making those radical movements. Sometimes we are afraid to use the word radical, but sometimes we need to push our political decision makers, because the policies are broken, I would say.
But there's there's one good to that. Maloko Garden, across from Maloko Garden, Cheyenne's son has just been given land by York University.
Oh, Sundance House.
I said, how are you? So I think that's a good thing to bring up.
I can talk about it.
Yeah, please. So I just want to add that without knowing that she's here.
Yeah, do you want to speak on it?
I'll talk about it because it's relevant to.
Yeah, we are having conversations trying to do this at York.
I'll stand up too.
Yeah.
Hey, what's good? I'm Cheyenne Sundance. So speaking about what you said, thanks for calling me in or out, whatever. I always forget. Yeah, so, that was fun. Sorry. Yeah, so I run Sundance Harvest, which is a year-round urban farm in Toronto, which feeds a lot of families. I really focus on urban agriculture because growing up food insecure, I didn't have access to fresh vegetables until I was 7 and a local food bank came to my neighborhood. So I really care about feeding communities where we are. And so, I'll just speak normally without this.
I'll do this one back.
Oh, I'm okay. So, okay, fine.
That's good.
So I'm lucky enough that two amazing folks at York University, Sylvia and Judy, reached out to me through Leticia as well, mentioning my name. And near Maloko Garden, they gave my cooperative, Radical Roots Cooperative, 6,000 square feet of land. And it's actually a really big deal because I haven't seen a university actually do something like that. And Radical Roots is a cooperative made by youth, primarily under 25, that are BIPOC, which basically means Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer and trans youth. So it's made of me, Sinclair, Adjua, and Nikita, which are all my friends through agriculture, and I've learned and I've grown with them. And basically Radical Roots sells the produce because I do believe in creating income for us, especially under capitalism. It's nice to trade and barter, and I trade, I would say 30% of my produce, but then I also have to pay rent. So Radical Roots Cooperative sells our produce at farmers markets and also at community stands at cost, so we don't overcharge our produce. However, all of our cooperative members make enough to live, which is something I think that's really important with agriculture, especially with youth and getting youth involved. So yeah, York University, near Maloko Garden, you'll see us this year, farming, yeah. That's really all. Trying not to hijack things.
And also just one point on that, if we are trying to expand these conversations, move them forward at York, so if folks are interested in that, being involved in that conversation, there's a sign-up sheet. And folks at Maloko Gardens have been, wonderful and engaged. But I'm also hearing at Maloko that there's not a lot of capacity. They're as usual. They're super under resourced. There's not a lot of support. So what ways can we at York support that work? Use our resources towards supporting that work. So maybe.
I just wanted to add one point. As we were talking about Maloko Gardens, I looked around and noticed that a lot of the elders that started this work with us in the city of Toronto aren't here. We have a lot of people that are impacted by mental health pushing through this conversation when, you know, talking about anti-Black racism, talking about racism wasn't actually the cool thing to do or the thing to say. It was actually determined to be a mental health disorder that you were kind of harassing other communities. So as we're doing this work, just remember that those elders aren't here, and they're not here because they are impacted by the mental health. You know, when we talked about Maloka Gardens, the first thing I thought about was Damien, like, you know, and that was such a heavy project for him, an amazing project, and he is now in another country. Like, he packed up his family and he left, and he's never looked back, and that was for a reason. So as we are advancing forward, there are still people that did that work that are in this city right now that are by themselves, that are feeling the weight of what it was to start that work, and we can't continue to move forward without you know, making sure that they are with us.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I guess we'll end it just thanking the panelists. Round of applause. Oh, book, and the book is available, just at the back. Taryn can take care of that. And, solidarity and support. So, this is sort of like what I was able to gather this morning, but there's updates, so there's an action in just north of Toronto starting now. So if folks, there's the Toronto Rapid Response Tyendinaga Solidarity Facebook page that you can go to and see the update for the location. And there's also, you can donate to Tyendinaga donations, also Wet'suwet'en Legal Fund. And Real People's Media has ongoing updates for blockades, actions happening. And like I said, there's an action today, there's a rally on Sunday, and there's also Yves Saint is speaking. You can also see that there's a Facebook page. Yves Saint is a land defender in Wet'suwet'en who's here now for a couple days. So if you, I don't know, Google Yves Saint.
I think she's at New College in Wilson Hall.
That's right. Thank you.
6 p.m.
Thank you. 6 to 8 p.m. New College.
University of Toronto.
that on the Facebook event page?
Sure. Yeah, actually, I will do that. That's great. I was like, how do I actually get that to people? I will post that on Facebook. I think that's everything. Thank you so much for coming. Again, sign up. Hope to see folks at the rallies. Thank you so much.